make sure, Bill Foley, I'm trying to think, the year 19, I hadn't been here around long. I was still working for Peter Clerk and Bob Laughlin and all that crowd. And I was coming up my road. There was no stop sign. And I came to a dead stop. The weather was miserable. I pulled out and smacked into a state trooper. So I go down to the station. I said, I caused the accident. It's my fault. So they said, well, we're going to give you a ticket because you failed to yield. And I said, no, I didn't fail to yield. I was at a dead stop. They gave me the ticket. So I go to court. Now, Peter's representing me.
Yeah.
And what's his name? Tom McKelvey.
Oh, my gosh, yeah.
He was the Village of Fredonia judge, but Dick Whipple, who I was in practice with, was the town of Pomfret where this happened. So they stick Tom with it. And Bill Foley's prosecuting me. And of course, it didn't take very long to find me guilty. So I said, I'm filing a notice of appeal. And I did. And it goes in front of Lee Town Adams. And at that time, Sue Amsler, my classmate from law school, was his court attorney, writing his one-page decisions. The famous quote, as he overturned my conviction, the famous quote that I actually use in town court sometimes now, accidents do happen. And that's my Bill Foley story.
Oh, that is so wonderful.
When David Foley was elected judge, and he had a little party up at, I think, Shorewood, and I told him that, I said, you know about your father prosecuting me? That was a good story, though. It was a good time.
So, Lydia, this is a thrill for me. Were you destined to be a lawyer? Was that in your family genealogy?
When I was 10 or 11, one of the lawyers down the street gave me a book about Oliver Wendell Holmes. And he inscribed it, to a future lawyer. So that was not what I was going to do. I majored in theater and then spent some time in England. And all that time in the back of my mind was, you could always, maybe you should go to law school. And my cousin had gone to UB.
Okay.
And I was, yes, so.
Where are you from?
I was born on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, East 12th Street and Avenue B, which was not far from where Bob Nieto grew up, Stuyvesant town. Yeah. Good Bob. And then we moved to Long Island when I was about 10, Seaford, and I graduated high school there.
And you graduated from high school there and then went off to college someplace?
Well, I did a year at Skidmore. It was still an all-girls school, and I was interested in the theater. And I met a couple of people from Antioch College, which in those days, still I suppose, was a kind of wild place. So I transferred. And I got to Antioch in August of 1968. Campus was deserted. There was no one there. And so I said, where is everyone? They said, oh, they're in Chicago at the convention.
Sure, Democratic convention. Oh.
Yeah, they were all, so I didn't get to go. But so I went to Antioch College, and I did a master's degree I majored in theater. I did a master's degree in Leeds University in England, in theater.
Right.
And I wasn't very good at it. I mean, never going to be Meryl Streep. And in the meantime, I had been living in Belgium. And I decided to take the LSATs. And I found out that they were being given at the American School in Brussels. Mm-hmm. So that's where I took them.
Ironically, my nephew works there. He's a teacher there.
Awesome. Are you kidding?
Yeah, small world.
It is a small world, yeah. And so then I got accepted at UB, and that was the end of that.
So you end up going to University of Buffalo, but had you had family in this area?
My cousin, Jason, who's from Queens,
okay.
He went to Francis Lewis High School, and he came up here. But by the time I got here, he was in Rochester, clerking for Judge Bonadeo in family court. So no, I was up here. It was a state school. I didn't have a lot of money. And
it's the only state school.
It is.
State law school.
That's right. And I graduated, and you're not going to believe this, I owed $17,000. Do you know how much doesn't even cover a semester now?
No, not at all. So you're there, but you're still an Eastern lady in a Western New York area. Did you know what you were going to do once you graduated?
I wanted to be a small-town country lawyer. I grew up in the city or near the city. I had friends in the city. And I just wanted to be a small-town country lawyer. I didn't really have any big ambitions. At one point, I thought I'd do criminal law, but after my first criminal jury trial, I decided that wasn't it. I won, but I wasn't, thrilled. I did go up to, I practiced in northern Maine for a couple of years.
Oh, did you?
When I graduated law school, I interviewed here with Brant Laughlin, Jacques Whipple, and Clerk at that time. And Don Brandt was going to teach at the college, and he wanted somebody to train in his state work. And after the interview, I think 4 out of the 5 or whatever wanted me, and one lawyer from Westfield,
Who remained nameless.
who remained nameless, said, I don't think Westfield is ready for a woman yet. So I was offered a job up in northern Maine in Aroostook County, Presque Isle. And I went up there, and I practiced for about 1.5 years, and out of the blue, I got a call from Peter Clark.
From the same law firm?
Yes, from the same firm. And he said, we're ready for a woman now. They'd hired somebody who didn't work out. And turned out, of course, Bob and I got along wonderfully. But he said, what will it take to get you back? And I said, well, let's start with moving expenses. And so in 1982, I moved here. And in 1983, I bought a house in Sheridan. And been here ever since.
When you joined Brant Laughlin it was still Brant Laughlin at the
It was
time.
Brant Laughlin, Shapp, Whipple, and Clark.
Yep. And they had offices in Westfield, Fredonia, and
Mayville. Yeah, we had one in Silver Creek, but that didn't work out.
But that was sort of unusual at the time. I don't think any other firm had.
No, I think it was one of the larger firms in the area. And
aside from you, who else was in the firm? I mean, the 5 you mentioned, the 5 named partners.
that was it. Well, Don Brandt, who of course was the trust and estate lawyer, but unfortunately he passed away in 1985,
So
cancer.
shortly
He
after
was
you came.
young,
Yeah.
yes, because he had taken me under his wing. In fact, he had wanted me to take the Florida bar. I think they were thinking of opening an office down there. But after he passed away, I stayed, worked with Bart Shack, who was manning the Mayville office. And Peter and Dick were in the Fredonia with me. And Bob was out in Westfield. And I would travel back and forth doing the estate work for all 3 firms. And that's how I got to know Willard Cass. I appeared in front of him a lot.
So Bob, shortly thereafter, also became county attorney.
Yes, he did. Bob, after Don died, the firm was kind of going, not necessarily going its separate ways, but with 3 offices, and one person was doing matrimonials, another was doing that. And Bob was offered, and of course Bob was in his probably late 50s, early 60s, and he had been a trial attorney, a personal injury attorney. And so he was, Jack Glenser was it, that offered him the position as county attorney. And so his office was right above Judge Willard's office. And one day did you want to?
Sure, no, absolutely. It's interesting. How did you become the
chief clerk.
Yeah.
So I've been appearing in front of Judge Willard for years, and he was tough. I mean, I wasn't sure because I had at least one trial and trust case in front of him, and he was, right on time, this, that. And I got a call from him up in Dunkirk, and he said, Lydia, I'm looking for a clerk. Autumn Slider is retiring. Mm-hmm. And I'd like an attorney for the position. Autumn wasn't. You were recommended. Somebody said I should talk to you. So it turned out it was Bob Laughlin. So he said, would you come and meet me in Dunkirk? We were there every Wednesday, the third or the fourth Wednesday of the month. Maybe this. The surrogates court held court. You remember in the old days, we once a month in Dunkirk and every week in Jamestown. So I went up to see Judge Willard, and first thing he says to me, now they're going to ask you questions. It's a panel. It was the first OCA panel, Office of Court Administration. The law says you serve at the pleasure of the surrogate, but OCA kind of said, maybe not. So they had this panel, and Judge Willard said they're going to ask you these questions. So I'm going to ask you a question. He says, what is an administration CTA? Bingo, I knew the answer. And that was a tough one, So a few weeks later, I interviewed, and I heard later that Bob Laughlin had come down the stairs, gone storming into Judge's office and said, this is the one you need to hire. Yeah. So June of, I want to say it was June, of 1990 is when I became the chief clerk.
Who was I know Cindy had been previously a clerk to...
She was Peter Clark's secretary. Cindy Bassinet?
No, Cindy.
Your Cindy. She was Judge, I'm getting,
Yeah, Cindy.
She was Judge Willard's clerk.
And Adams way back when.
Way back when. That was her first job.
Yeah.
And Bill Foley, they used to say, oh, Cindy, she was just a shining, smiling joy to be around. She was, oh, let's go see. And when she left, I think Tom White got the job.
I think that's right, yeah.
And it was only part-time. And then sometime in the 80s, maybe, they said, no, we want all full-time. But Judge Cass had by then hired Marlene as matrimonial, so he was allowed, he kept both of them. And eventually she did the matrimonials and some of the estate work. So they were his two court attorneys. And they stayed on when Judge Willard retired and Stephen Cass took over.
Yeah. So you get a job which heretofore was Autumn's. Did Autumn hang around and mentor you?
Yeah, she did. She did. And Autumn was like, she knew it all. She did it all herself. And we had no computers. And I would walk in, and there would be a pile of proceedings. And there were 3 other women in the office. And she'd say, no, you have to. So I'd go through them all. She'd stand over me. And then I used to have to sign, the certificates of appointment that we print off the computer now. She used to give me these pads, and I think they had like 500 or so on each one. And she bought me one of these lap desks so that I could go home and sign my name on all of these certificates. Mm-hmm. And so she stuck around for about 6 months. Mm-hmm. And then I got a call from the Office of Court Administration. Excuse me.
Do you have water?
No, I'm good.
Good, okay.
And they said, we want to come down and see you. And they said, now, your predecessor was very resistant to technology, and you have to have a computer. And you also have to start keeping different books, financial, and that they made an exception, for Autumn and Florence, was it Florence Fuller out in County, yeah. Judge Horry's, but they said, now we're gonna do it this way. So I had to be re-educated and at that point I had Mary Lou Paulus, who was a genius, and she started helping me out with some of the work in Ruth's Court, Sandy's Ends. We had a nice office. And I delegated,
But it was your office. There was nobody would ever say otherwise. This was Lydia's office. And what was the biggest speed bump for you? I mean, you're in the private side. Now all of a sudden you're in an administrative public side. You're an employee of the state.
That was the biggest speed bump. Used to being the one to decide, make the decisions, and common sense, whatever. And I remember it was a silly little thing, but I'd been given a gift by the Brant Laughlin when I left. It was like an ink pen and a stand. And when I ran out of ink, I ordered ink from the state, from and they told me I couldn't do that because it was a private pen. So it was for me, I've never been good with authority, and we had Harry Brand there running things, and remember Harry, and Judge Kane was the first administrative judge that I was aware of, and it was a difficult time because OCA was just getting into the courts, and family court was taking off with the issues that they were having, and so they were pouring money into family court. And it was difficult. I did not enjoy working for the state. If this is going to be on tape, that's fine. But I didn't mind because I could do the work. I mean, the administrative work was nothing. Yeah. And as long as they didn't interfere with my legal, don't start telling me the law, because I can read the law. And we managed. Judge Willard and I got in trouble a few times because they actually laid off people at one point. And we were hard pressed to, we carried on a bit, and so they said, no, surrogates court can't have any more employees now, and that was for a few months.
It was also, I believe, during that time where the Erie County Surrogates Court was under some scrutiny.
Judge Matina?
Yeah. And did that aspect of, because I got a lot of press.
Yes, it did.
Did it float downstream just because you were surrogates that it affected other surrogates in the state?
It did. Not particularly Chautauqua, and I'll explain that in a minute. But Judge Matina and Stan Colasano and Mary D. Martocci, Sal Martocci, that was Judge Martocci. That was that whole crew down there, and it involved the public administrator and the attorney for the public administrator. That is still going on. I'm on a committee now that the Brooklyn surrogate, one of the Brooklyn surrogates, has a plan where she wants to turn over the appointment of public administrators and counsel to the city, to the mayor. And there's a lot of discussion about that, but it's never been resolved. Right after Judge Matina did fine. He and I traveled quite a bit with Judge Matina in the 90s. We were both on this electronic committee, and I became very fond of him. But at the same time, they had the Brooklyn surrogate, Michael Feinberg.
Right, my gosh.
And he had to leave. And I think Lula Reno got in some trouble too. And then it died down.
It was essentially being favoritism, sort of appointments,
Well, yeah, in Chautauqua County, we don't have a public administrator. The only public administrators are in Erie, Onondaga, maybe not Onondaga, but definitely Erie, Rochester City, Nassau, Suffolk, and the city courts. They are appointed by the surrogate. They receive a commission. There are guidelines as to how much they can charge, and they hired the attorneys who handle the estate. And in some counties, that's very lucrative, because the public administrator, for the most part, is dealing with estates where there are unknown heirs, sometimes unknown beneficiaries. In Chautauqua County, we don't have a public administrator. We have a director of finance who acts as the public administrator. And at that time, see my mind, I can see him, but I can't remember him. He did a ton of investing, did very well under Glenzer. I can't remember his name. And then we've had 3 or 4 public administrators. Now it's Kitty Crow, the director of finance. But back, I'm going to say at least 10 years ago, maybe, Judge Stephen Cass and I were on a surrogates court committee to rewrite the guidelines for both the public administrators and the directors of finance. And we even appeared on a video presentation. So we had quite a bit to do with trying to straighten things out, particularly upstate. Some counties elect, some counties appoint. In Chautauqua, the director of finance is appointed by the legislature. We've been very lucky, though. We've had some very good ones.
And I got my mind thinking about the guy who was a tremendous investor.
Yeah, and
ends with a B, I think. It'll come to us.
Yeah.
So you, during this time period, you are in the epicenter of activity. Most all law firms have at least a representative within the firm that does surrogates court work. And they have to deal with you, Lydia Roma. So therefore, you had a chance to deal with personalities and judges because you're there in Mayville. And I'm gonna show you, at least from the Jamestown Bar, a composite. And wondered if you could just kind of float through there. And if there's a vignette or a story or something you'd say, Greg, on such and such a person, feel free to do so. If you find that after we get done, you say, I shouldn't have said that, I edited it out.
Okay. I'll go through the top row pretty quickly. Sure. James Abdullah was a sweetheart.
Yeah.
One of the nicest guys you'd ever meet, a real gentleman. He was I had like not necessarily a fan club, but I had a Monday morning crew. Remember when we were over on the other side of the building, we shared the family court, that little courtroom that wasn't a jury courtroom, with Judge Hartley. We shared the family surrogate courtroom. And Judge Willard's office was on one side, and there was a door connecting us, and then there was my office. And so the lawyers would love to come in, some of them, I'll tell you which ones, would love to come in on Monday mornings when we had and actually present the papers to me. Some of the old-time lawyers didn't like mailing their wills, for one thing, and I would have them sit down, and I'd kind of be going through it, but while I was going through it, I was picking their brain for stuff like Ed Kuzdale. He had these Polish ancestors, and way back when I had family, and he had a daughter who was up in Toronto teaching, And then, of course, we always commiserated about his son, the city court judge now, John, who at that time was practicing, I think, with Ed. So we had Stephen, of course, he's still around. Bob Alessi didn't have a lot to do with him.
Did you have anything to do? He was, for a period of time, the New York State...
Yes, the tax commissioner. Yeah, those were the good old days when he'd meet you at the bank, you'd open the box and you'd be done, right? He'd release it, he'd resign a seat, and you were done. You didn't have to send papers to Albany or Buffalo. Yeah, I did. He did come down, and I did have some meetings with him. Yeah, and his brother, Sam Alessi, he was the city court judge, right? Paul Andrews, he just retired not too long ago. He was, I'll tell you, Paul and I got to be very good friends, along with, I'll see it in a minute, I'll tell you. Our kids were all the same age. And we all met at Cockaigne on Sundays for the Jelly Roll and the Super Squad. And Paul's wife and the kids were and what's his name? He was with Ken Lasker.
Yep.
He's gone now. I didn't know that, but he's out west.
He's out west.
Ken's had two boys. My son was in between. And then his wife, she had just given birth to a baby, and she would sit up at the clubhouse, and we'd come in during the break and have hot chocolate. And every time I would see Ken, even like 10 years ago, I'd say, Ken, how's the baby? Say, the baby just graduated college. Yeah, so let's go. So that was Paul. I got a lot of stories about Arthur Bailey.
Did he come in? Was there litigation before Judge Cass that was circuit court litigation?
Yeah. He did. We had this estate. It was a very peculiar estate. This guy had died in his hot tub. Do you remember this? Down in somewhere on the lake, Chautauqua Lake. They had a house, and they were into antiques. And the woman comes down. She finds her husband dead in the hot tub. She goes upstairs and goes to bed. You might not want to.
Keep going. We'll decide.
And the point being, she goes upstairs. She goes to bed. She calls the fire department in the morning. And then the estate, and their objections to the will, and she decides there was a specific bequest to the fire department, which she didn't want to give them. And Arthur Bailey was representing her, and it was interesting. Yeah. But there was another case with Arthur Bailey. I'm trying to think. He had a case with Judge Willard. It was foreclosure that might have gone into surrogate's court for some reason. But when Arthur appeared mostly in Supreme, if we heard that Arthur was going to be in court, we would all try to get out of work to go and sit in the back of the Supreme Court to listen to him. This is his.
He's always a great command of the King's English.
Yes, I have a lot of Arthur Bailey stories, and probably not too many I can tell.
Okay, I get it.
Mark Barger, he was with, he was young. He started with Lanny Sheffield. Right. And what I remember most about that firm was Lanny's wife, Marie. Yeah, she was basically the surrogate practitioner in the office.
And a force of nature, lovingly a force of nature.
Yes. Do you know, even after Lanny moved to Las Vegas, I believe, Marie was calling me. Okay. Yeah. I didn't know Charlie Beckstrom very well at all. Mm-hmm. And Bill Benka for a very short time. I did know Dave Blossom. And I think there was an estate which left money to one of his favorite charities, the Airplane Museum.
Right, museum, right.
And when he passed away, his will was a bit complicated, but he did leave money to them. And he always wore the sneakers.
Always a sneaker.
Dalton was doing all the personal injury at that time.
Did you court that Judge Cass, who could be an acting Supreme Court justice, what kind of cases normally, when he was acting, would he be hearing?
Matrimonials. Judge Willard did matrimonial. He hated criminal.
Okay.
And he was considered like the hanging judge for criminal work. And I remember when Judge Willard would be away, you know, if he would go take a vacation or something, he'd say to me, now while I'm gone, you take all your paperwork over to Judge Leetown Adams. And those of you who remember, Leetown was very tight. He didn't like to give out any money. So like, let's say I had an estate and I needed a decree signed, and Judge Willard hadn't set the guardian ad litem fee. Normally, he'd set it at 100 in those days, and Judge Adams would cut it down to 75. So when the lawyers would call me, where's my decree, where's my decree? I'd say, well, Judge Willard is out of town, but if you really want it signed, I'll take it over to Judge Adams. No. And the same would happen when Judge Willard was on the bench doing his Judge Adams criminal work. They'd all want to get it adjourned back to, because he was tough on, and why not? But he did a lot of family court. Do you remember back, I would say it had to be the late 80s, when Judge Hartley had that back surgery and then neck surgery? Judge Willard was doing the family court that whole time. Boom, boom, boom. He was quick.
No, that was
he used to say to me, I'd say, Judge, do you want to pre-try this? The lawyers want to talk. He'd say, I can try that case faster than I can settle it. But yeah, Sherry Cadwell, your buddy.
Yeah.
Is he still around?
No, I passed away a couple years ago.
Sorry to hear about that. He was the trust and estate guru, and at the time when we had Lou Giacali was the Bill Maldivin, the AG. Right. I remember we had a couple of big estates. Oh, the Bertha Hamilton estate. I thought about that recently because of Bob Schnitzler, and they have a room named for him at the Humane the Chautauqua Humane Society. He was involved in that Hamilton estate too, a little bit later on. And
that's got a whole litigation history of itself.
Yes, it does. As long ago as I've been gone almost 7 years now, and here. Yep. And Steve Cass, Judge Stephen Cass, had a case with them, and we went in front of all the Supreme Court judges in Buffalo. It was me, Marlene, and Judge Stephen, and we just sat there. Sam Green was there, and Doris Denman, and Judge Cass was trying to tell them that the money was supposed to stay in Chautauqua County. And it didn't, it went up on appeal. But it was interesting. Yeah, it was interesting. But I do think that made them aware of the fact that there were charitable needs here because they were giving them out all over the place.
Yeah.
Remember? Yeah.
A lot of publicity.
Yeah. Phil Calla, I'll skip him.
I got to interview Phil, even though he's kind of young. I got to interview because he's a legend unto himself.
He is a legend. I got to tell you, he had this one client, Sean something or other, who hated him, and he once even tried to beat him up downtown, and Phil punched him, and the same client had a vendetta against Judge Stephen Cass.
No.
And I always kind of blamed Phil for that. In fact, security had a little picture of the guy. So they would know if he came to see Judge Cass, he wasn't allowed to. But Phil and I of course, we talked. He and Judge John Lamacuso used to come up to the Northern Bar a lot for meetings. You ought to talk to Phil. Yeah.
Oh, well, he's beautiful.
Park Catchpole. I did know Park. He was a gentleman too.
Yeah.
He was always a gentleman. Didn't have a lot, but he would come in sometimes on a Monday and bring in his paperwork. Judge Claire, of course, I was very good friends with. Still, we used to be, when she was Judge Gerassi's court attorney, we would walk together whenever we could at lunch, and before they moved her up to the building on the hill. Even after she became a judge, she'd call me if her calendar got done early, and we'd walk. And her husband, who's around here somewhere, Bob Van Avery, he rooms with my cousin in law school.
No kidding.
Yeah, so it was very interesting because my cousin was quite a character, and Bob remembered him. Thaddeus Clark, I didn't really know him. He was he worked over in social services. And Howard Crosley, he used to come in on Monday mornings and hand in his paperwork.
Well, he was a guy that built like you as far as theater.
Yes.
I mean, he just couldn't. He did local thespian work here, but also he was just. He was a show.
He would come into court, Monday mornings, and he'd first go over to Mary Lou, and then Sheehan, and that's what they'd always do. They'd come in and say Sheehan. But yeah, Howard was and Chuck D'Angelo, he's still here. What can you say about Chuck? He's a sweetheart. Tough as nails when he has to be. But and Chuck has a son the same age as my son, so I think we and Hope is still around.
Yeah.
When one thing I remember about Hope is I didn't really know her, but we had both signed up for a seminar in Buffalo, and we drove in together, and we became good friends. And I don't know if she still represents Casadega, but she did for years.
I think so, yeah.
And her two little girls, Tom Dory, he's still around, I think, yeah. He was he and Don Mahalik were good friends, because and there was maybe one or two others that would commute to UB Law when instead of living on campus. So there was a little clique there, and Tom was a good guy. He worked for social services, and then he became a bankruptcy trustee. Bill Duncanson, he was a good guy. He was another one of the ones who liked to come in on Monday mornings, hand me his paperwork. And of course his son Bill Jr. is still around. Mm-hmm. He doesn't do as much surrogate, and Mark never did much either. You want me to start on Phil Erickson?
Sure, absolutely.
Phil Erickson was one of the smartest lawyers you'd ever meet, and he was also one of the most cantankerous. And I could remember if Phil came to court in Jamestown, Judge Willard would stay in his office, and they'd say, "What are you doing in here?" And he'd say, he said, "I'm waiting until Lydia and Phil get done yelling at each other, and then I'll come in." And then Bruce Skolton would call me, and he'd say, "Lydia, Phil would like me to talk to you." But Phil let me tell you, this is kind of interesting.
Sure.
I had a call from somebody up in Massachusetts, and they were looking for a trial transcript or a appeal brief, on the Midway. Do you know the Midway property? Mm-hmm. on Chautauqua Lake? And they had asked me to pull up some information that they wanted. The file is in the basement. I dig around, I find it. And it turns out that there was this British guy who had a wife and children in Britain. And he left them over there and came here and had another wife and children. And he owned Midway. And a very young Phil Erickson was representing the wife in Britain. It was an interesting case. I don't remember the outcome. I just saw Phil Erickson's name. I was like, I can't believe it. He was annoying people even then. But he had that Cheney case too. You weren't involved in that.
No,
right?
I wasn't, but we're
John
familiar with
Plum. Yeah. That was one of our 2 jury trials. We had the Cheney case with Chuck Hall and John Plum, and Phil had did some work there, and then they went down to Florida and did another will, and that was an interesting case. We started trying that case in the family courtroom because we didn't have and we wound up finishing it in the legislative chambers.
Really?
That was one of the first cases that we did all with the electronic recording. So anyway, that was Phil. He was like a father to Bruce, I have to tell you, And I think with all of the back and forth, it was kind of almost like a game,
Yeah.
And of course, I miss Bruce a lot. He's the one lawyer that actually, not the one lawyer, but he found me wrong. I said, Bruce, you got that one. We had this little discussion about something or other, and he went and researched it, and I said, Bruce, you're right. And you talked with Bruce before. He was just brilliant, brilliant.
Brilliant, no question.
And Richard Fessenden's still around. Fessenden was Judge Hartley's. He was was he Judge Hartley's court attorney? No.
No, they were partners in practice for a while. Hartley and Fessenden.
Okay, and Kevin Laumer, who is Judge Hartley's half brother.
Right?
Okay. Tom Flowers. He's still around. I saw Tom not too long ago, but he's not practicing. I think when Connie Rounds died, she was really the trust and estate guru with that firm. But Tom was a CPA, and we had a trial with Tom over the Attorney General objected to his fees. I think it was one of those. I'm not sure if it was an attorney fiduciary or something, but I think we settled that one too. But Tom was a very careful practitioner, very careful. Mike Foley, he left us.
He's in New York City?
Yes, he did. He told me he had an apartment right around the corner from Bloomingdale's. I don't know how I remember these things, Greg.
I don't know that I knew that, but yeah.
And Al Ford, too. He went down to Florida. We had some cases with Al Ford. Mike Goldman. Where's Michael now?
I'm still practicing here.
He's still? Yeah. His daughter, Emily, used to babysit my son at the Institute.
No kidding.
With his brother-in-law, Stan Lundeen, they had shared the house there. And so I would drop Nick off at their day camp, and then when they take their break, Emily would get him and bring him back. And so we became good friends. John Goodell. He was a warrior.
Good term.
He was a warrior. And I'll tell you, he raised a couple of ambitious children. Rick is still in Buffalo. I don't know if Rick started out with the consumer complaints, something with the AG. And of course, Andrew, who's our legislator now. And John was John. And Chuck Hall. Chuck is still practicing too. Another real gentleman. Really? Just another, and he did a lot of trust and estate work. He had the Pink Martini case.
What's that?
This involves Phil Callan. Phil Calla had this client who sold Christmas trees. And everybody thought he was poor as a church mouse. And he had made an appointment with Phil to draw a will, and he brought in his old will, and then he died. And his old will left everything to this woman who, with an address on West 7th Street in Manhattan, 71 West 7th Street in Manhattan. And her name was Peggy Ford Woodford, or Peggy Winford Ford. I remember that because the pink martini story. So anyway, the will was drawn in like 1970 something. And so Phil gives the will to Chuck Hall, and Chuck Hall comes in to me and he says, what do we do with this? He says, I don't have distributees. The guy, apparently his wife and kids were all killed in an accident in Alaska. I don't even know if that was true or not, but he had no known distributees, and the only person was this Peggy Woodford. So Judge Stephen Cass comes in and he says, why don't you give Lydia a few days? She's really good with this ancestry stuff. So I hunted around and I found this singer named China Forbes. And she was the lead singer in this group called Pink Martini out of Seattle. And actually it's they've played the Philharmonic, they came to UB, they've played in Europe. Two friends who met at Harvard and formed this band. They do multilingual, cultural. So I found her name, and one of her relatives was Peggy Forbes Woodford, Forbes Woodford or something. So I sent her an email and I said, if you were the China Forbes whose mother, Peggy Woodford Forbes, lived in Manhattan in the 1970s, would you please have her contact me? Heard nothing. A couple of weeks go by, and then I get a phone call from this lawyer out in California. And I answer the phone. He says, why are you looking for my wife?
Really?
And I said, I don't know if I'm looking for your wife, but if she is your wife, there's a fairly decent sized estate. There's a couple of $100,000. And I gave him Chuck Hall's name. And guess what? Peggy Woodford Forbes, or Peg, had been a stockbroker with Merrill Lynch, and this client of Phil's had lived in Manhattan for a short time, and she had been very good to him, and he trusted her, and he left her all his money.
I'll be damned.
So the Pink Martini actually came to Buffalo about a year later, and my son and I did go to see them at the, and ever since then, we've been going to see them at Chautauqua.
Yeah, they're huge.
Yeah, and we've she wanted to give me a gift, and I said no. I did it. It was fun, but I can't accept gifts. She calls Judge Cass, and he says, oh, she wouldn't take it. So I said, you know what? I'd like to go backstage and meet your daughter. So that's what happened. Yeah. So that was the Pink Martini story.
That's a great story.
Isn't that a good story?
Yeah,
It was,
yeah.
and a success story. And you know what? The woman, she was one of the first black women who graduated Harvard, was a stockbroker when she married, and she married a guy out in California. She divorced her first. And she was like the chairman of all these charitable organizations out there. They lived in Beverly Hills, I believe. And I believe that quite a bit of that money went to charity.
Good. That's a good ending. Great story.
It was a good, yeah. You want me to keep going here?
Please, you're on a roll.
So we have Chuck. Mark Hampton, another gentleman, dealt with him once in a while. Wayne Herrick, I remember him, but I didn't have a lot to do with him.
Yeah, social services.
Yes, he was social services. He was before Tad or after Dad Clark, or he was different. They had two separate.
Right.
He might have been the commissioner,
Yeah.
and Tad worked in the attorney's office.
Right.
He was, and Marty Itzik. How's he doing? Didn't know Ken Johnson or Paul Johnson. We all know John Lemoncuso, Judge John. You know, his son practices, of course. He's been in front of me in the town of Sheridan.
No, is that right?
And he is so adorable every time he comes in. I says, God, you must take after your mother. But he does. He's a good guy. He actually had a couple of difficult cases there. And John still comes up to our northern bar. If we ever have a Christmas party again, it'd be nice. Fred Larson, he's our city court judge. Now, Fred had a huge estate practice. And interestingly enough, when I was at Antioch in college, I did 2 semesters at Princeton at the McCarter Theater. I worked, Antioch was a work-study college. And so I was there probably a few years before Fred, but we did have some common ground. And yeah, Fred was another brilliant.
Oh, very good.
And I don't know Stan Lundeen, he didn't practice, but I know who. And of course, Judge Gerasi. He says here, New York State Director of Rural Affairs. But I know him from when he became a Supreme Court judge, and then when he became a JHO, he used to come to our office for coffee because he didn't really have an office, so we kind of made a space for him.
Before we go on, I'm not sure he's on that composite, but give me your best Leetown Adams story.
Leetown? I had a good one, let me think. I'll leave it to Judge Cass to tell you about the Lucian and the Indians, or if you had that one already.
No.
Let me tell you, and then, because I have, the good stories I have about Leetown with the Genesee Ale and the Bar Association, and I would go there every afternoon at 3 if Judge Cass was recused on something, or if he was out of town, and he'd be playing that old deck of cards and the spittoon in the corner and his pens. But anyway, so this is a story that Lucian told. And it goes back a long way. And he and Judge Adams were both attorneys on opposite sides of a dispute with the Seneca Nation. And it had to be resolved in the Indian court, as they called it in those days. And Lucian, young lawyer, studied up. He knew, he knew his law. He had it right, and he was going to win this one. And so he goes to the court at the appointed time, and out of the building comes Leetown Adams with a pack of Genesee Ale and all of the court, the whole court, and they're all sitting around drinking and talking, and I believe Lucian lost. I did go to Leetown's funeral, and he was such a character. He used to, he'd walk along Mayville every lunchtime reading his newspaper. Mm-hmm. He wouldn't miss a beat, and he wouldn't look up. Right. And shortest decisions, he always used to say, if you can't write it in one page, it is not worth writing. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know, I probably have some other good Lee stories, but Judge Hartley, of course. First time I met Judge Hartley, I believe he was shucking oysters or clams at the Dean Edelman at your Jamestown picnic. Right. Bart Shack wanted to make sure that I went, got to know everybody on both sides. And of course, Ken Lasker. I said, you know, I met him, Kevin Lawmer. Lucian. I loved Lucian. And everybody in my office was scared to death of him. And whenever he'd call, as soon as they'd say, it's Lucian, they'd say, just a minute, you have to talk to her. But, you know, he was just a big bear of a guy. He'd come in, you know, carrying on. And the funniest things, and you know, he and Bill were good friends. Bill, I call him Bill now, but when he was Judge Willard, he used to say, call me Bill, and I'd never call him Bill.
Yeah.
They were really good friends. I think when Lucian passed away, that hurt a lot. But Lucian would, you know, he'd come in, he'd see him, and then he'd come, how you doing, honey? And I didn't care what he called me. He was just, you know, he was Lucian.
Yeah.
The best things were, when we used to have court over here in Jamestown, I would always have lunch with Joan Jesko. Remember Joan Jesko? And Mary Lou Kelly, Judge Willard's court reporter, at Lashandro's. And Doug Spoto and Lucian would have lunch at Lashandro's, and Doug would be sitting in one end of the room, Lucian would be on the other, and they'd still be fighting over their real estate deals. It was hysterical. Loved it. But yeah, Lucian was, I think everybody that knew Lucian loved him.
Yeah.
Don Lynn went back down to Florida, didn't he? He was a prosecutor down on DA. I did not know Ron Main. Didn't know Marshall, Al McKee. He was another one with social services, wasn't he?
Yeah, towards the end of his career. That's
Yeah. Didn't know Walter Miller, barely knew Ren Perley. Judge Ricotta.
Now that was your person up North County, right?
Yes, he was. You know, Judge Ricotta had his chambers in the Liberty Square Bank building. Do you remember? Did you ever have a chance to go up there?
I did.
There was like an outer office and an inner office, and we all stood outside, summer, winter. Now, Judge Hartley would use that office in the summer, but in the winter, we would go to the Armory in the north. We had no security. The chairs would be lined up in the Armory, and, you know, all the people, husbands, wives, kids fighting, they'd all be lined up sitting in chairs. But Judge Ricotta, I was president of the Bar Association back in Northern Bar back in 85 or 86, and we did his portrait. And he always remembered, you know, every time he'd see me, he was from the North End. Most of the time, Judge Ricotta, he and Tom Muldowney, his court reporter, would drive to Buffalo, and Judge Ricotta used to drive these old-fashioned cars at like 90 miles an hour on the thruway.
He had a pass.
Yeah, exactly. Let's see. Of course, Willard. I didn't know Willard Perley and your beautiful wife. Cynthia, she was, I'm trying to think, was it Charlie Pride? Who did she went to work for?
Right in Hampton.
Right in Hampton.
She's a partner there.
Bill Wright said all her clients would come in bringing her flowers.
And he never got any, I understand that.
Yeah, he was, and you and John Plum. John Plum was on, let me tell you about the Cheney, you can cut whatever you want out of this. John Plum was trying that Cheney case against Chuck Hall, Phil Erickson's old will. They were trying to throw it out because of this new Florida will, which left the Cheney farm to a brother out in Alaska who hadn't stayed on the farm like John Cheney and, you know, worked it, and the mother's will had left the farm to John. So there we are, and John Plum is trying to show that this Florida will is no good. The night before his witness was supposed to testify, one of the sisters, one of John and Bill Cheney's sisters. And he had her in the office, and she started talking to him about the will, and she said, "That is not my mother's will. I know that's not my mother's will, the Florida will." And John said, "How did you know that?" And she said, "My name is spelled wrong. My mother spelled my name wrong on my wedding invitations, and she would never do that again." But Bill spelled my name wrong all the time. Jury verdict. Throughout the will. John, that one, to me, that was the one. And John said to me afterwards, he said, it was like a gift, you know? But that was an interesting case. Charlie Price. Charlie comes in, and he was closing an estate, and he had his legal fees, and he wanted them fixed because he figured somebody will object. You know how it was in the old days. He cited the IRS. He said, "Well, I'll cite the IRS, and if they don't come in, I'm good." And I said, "But Charlie, we have preemption, you know. They're not going to show up in a state court." He says, "I don't care. As long as they don't show up, we're good." He was also, it's always troubled me, but you know where it says, so-and-so being duly sworn deposes and says? He always said, that's redundant. You don't need all that. If you're duly sworn, you don't have to depose, or something like that. But he did a lot of T&E work, and so did his brother Sam. And Don Brandt used to go to the Florida, you went to that one.
Once, yeah, but like they get all their CLE credits and
Yeah. He and Sam Price would go down every year. Sam Jr., of course, and Tom. Tom, I actually knew better when he ran his title company, because he was always in our office, you know, looking up stuff. And Tripp. And Tripp was a good guy.
Well, he was a Tripp, yeah.
Yeah, he probably was the first lawyer of our generation to die so young. You and I are about the same age, I think. And that was sad. He almost hit me with a golf ball, but I forgave him.
Big wind up, you know. He hit him far, but low.
Yeah. Well, the golf course, we were going, and he was coming, and it just went right over the top. Pat Rice, John, he's still around. He's with the Public Defender's Office.
Saw Pat the other day.
Yeah, I had an intern, a trainee, just a young lady that I had met who I was encouraging to go to law school, and she volunteered for the PD office and worked with Pat, and then she got into both UB and Cleveland and decided to go to Cleveland, which kind of annoyed me, but Dale's a sweetheart too.
Yep.
Dale he was just a saint. He still is, right? I haven't seen him in a while.
No, he's still very active, but yeah, he would do anything for any lawyer. He did a lot of things that were offline you wouldn't know about. He helped a lot of lawyers that...
And you know what? Some of his estates, I'm not going to tell Birgit, but if they couldn't afford it, he didn't charge.
Yeah.
You know, he was very... And I saw Neil not too long ago. Neil Robinson, he was in representing a client in Sheridan.
Is that right?
Yeah. And Neil was, second under John Ward and
Yep.
and Ron, what's his name? Gibbs. And Neil was, John Samuelson did a lot of trust and estate work. Still around? I don't know.
Yep.
Yeah. I did not know Tubby Scarpino, but I feel like I knew him because his damned estate and trust, every 5 years, something. I'd be pulling, that file was huge, and I'd be pulling that out every few years. I hear he was quite a character.
He was on every front.
And of course, we talked about Bruce. John Sellstrom, the Swedish ambassador.
Yep.
He did some estate work, and he was another one of Judge Willard's friends who liked to come in and see me on Mondays, and his son too when he started. Lanny, of course. Richard Slater. He had his office across the hall. The public defender's office was across the hall when I first started, and whenever we needed a guardian ad litem fast, Judge Cass would say, "Go drag Richard in here." You know, if we had an estate and we hadn't appointed somebody, he'd send me across the hall. And Sotier, Richard Sotier, I think he's golfing in the South now.
He's golfing everywhere. I've interviewed Richard, and yeah, he's enjoying golf in retirement.
He was one of those lawyers like me, just walked away.
Yeah, no question.
I tried walking away. I do a little bit, but you know, it's. He just said I'm done, and he went to wherever, Hilton Head or whatever. And Doug Spoto, first time I ever spoke to Doug. You know the, I think it's the Whiskey Hill now in Casadega.
Yeah.
In those days, it was something else. I can't remember the name of the bar, and I represented the owner who was selling to one of Doug's clients who couldn't get a liquor license for some reason. And it kept going on, and Doug had no idea who I was, and I had no idea who he was. And he'd, you know, get on the phone with me, and he'd start, you know, "Look, sweetie, this and that," and I'd say, "Look, honey, this and that." And we got that deal closed, and I really didn't have much to do with him after that until I came to Mayville, and he was another one of my favorite, you know, just a great guy. And like I say, he and Lucian would really, and you know, Doug said he would never golf. Do you remember him saying he would never golf?
Yeah, that was for the, you know, what a waste of time, and now he's a professional.
What does he do now?
That's all he does.
Dave Stapleton, is he still around? He always worked with the bank, or?
Well, he went. He would, you know, he was with Jim Abdallah for a period of time, and Saperston Day. When
Saperston Day was who he.
Office here, and
yeah,
that's Jim and Dave, and then Saperston Day left, and Jim. They parted, and then Dave went by himself, and he was a sole practitioner for up until last year.
Yeah, he did. He filed estates, you know, not a lot, but did a nice job. And then we have Subby, Jim Subjack, and he was a good guy too. He was something else. You know what, Greg, I miss. We had some real characters in the old days. You know, Lee Town had his little picayunes, or, you know, and Subby and Doug Spoto. I mean, we had, but Jimmy was DA shortly after I started. I came here in '82, and I think he was the DA for a while. And the last time I saw Jim before he moved, he was in Sheridan Town Court on a, actually it was a firearms violation, and he was, and he and his wife just picked up and moved to where their kids were. Janelle, right. And I haven't seen Bev Unger in ages. She was Judge Clare's court attorney, and she also had an office right across the hall. And I remember Bev, one year, Judge Clare had us all out to their place in Chautauqua cross-country skiing. And I was probably one of the worst. And I was kind of far behind everyone, and Bev stood, skied with me. And of course, Bob Van Avery. He did a huge, huge trust and estate business, and he was very precise, sometimes too precise. I'd say, Bob, give it up. Let's just publish, And of course, being married to Judge Clare, I was friends with both of them. And Paul Webb. We had some good cases with Paul, too. He did mostly matrimonials, but we had a few cases where he was doing the guardianship and the personal injury, and Judge Willard always called him Charlie. And another one who's meticulous was Stanley Weeks. Was a super nice guy. I didn't know him very well, but when you showed that movie of Stan Weeks with Robert H. Jackson meeting the train, that was very moving.
Yeah.
It was very moving. Ward Westerberg. We used to say Ward had his little ticker running at the bottom of his little stock ticker. If you want, you could always call Ward. What's the stock market doing? You remember that?
Well, their office on 2nd Street, right across from Bodell over Cash and Anderson. And if you needed to find Ward or Ron Malin, who you didn't know.
I didn't know, yeah.
Those two guys together would be over there reading the tickers, and they have it electronically, and that's where they were 24/7, seemingly.
I didn't know Clive Wright. He was called Bud, right?
Bud Wright, yeah.
He passed away shortly after I got there. But I know that he went to law school. I believe he, Bob Laughlin, Bill, and Bob all went to school together. And I didn't know Bob that well either, but I knew Bill very well.
Sure.
And Bill would come into our Thursday, bringing his paperwork in, and of course his son, well, he's not in this, I keep thinking this is 80, where are all these people? It's 87. Greg Yaw's Greg did. He still does maybe practice justice.
He's retired.
He's retired, good for him. And Brian York did not practice trust and estate.
No, he was in. So, trust and estates, you mentioned there were 2 trials, jury trials. One was at Cheney. What was the other one?
Oh, that was Gertz with Eddie Fagan.
Okay, talk to me.
Okay, Lloyd Gertz owned the property by the airport, the Gertz Road property.
Oh, okay.
Okay. And Lloyd Gertz he'd been single until he was like in his 50s. And then he married. And he married this woman who had a son. And in his will, he left her the life use of his property. But when he passed away, it was to go to his brothers. And he wanted to make sure it didn't go to the woman's son. And I'm thinking, I believe he might have hired Hodgson Ross out of Buffalo, the woman did. They were contesting the will because she didn't want the trust. And it was a liberal invasion, but we couldn't really understand it. But anyway, the brothers objected to the whole thing. And it turned out at trial. Now, so Ed Fagan comes in and he's representing the brothers, and we have a jury trial. And I can remember, there's things that stick out in your mind. So one morning, it was right the 2nd or 3rd day, and Ed Fagan is nowhere to be seen. Where is he? I don't know. And Judge Willard calls me and he says, Lydia, what time is it? And I said, Judge, it's 10 o'clock. We start at 10, bring the jury in. And I said, Ed Fagan's, I don't care, bring the jury in. We start at 10. I don't want them thinking that I'm the one that's keeping holding things up. And so I brought them in, and I sat there in my seat, and Judge Willard sat there, and we all sat there until it was about 10 minutes before Ed arrived, and his suspenders, and he's all, I was getting a signature, and Judge Willard, to his credit, he didn't say a word. He said, call your first witness, Mr. Fagan.
Says volumes.
It turned out that this woman's son was, he was gay, And Lloyd Gertz did not want him. He didn't like the son. I have no idea, what the situation was. But I know from the testimony that most people gave, he was happy to support the wife, did not want to support the son, and wanted the money to go to his brothers. And that's what eventually happened, I believe, which I thought was so dumb, because all she had to do was liberally invade it.
Sure.
Why did they go to all that trouble? So those 2 jury trials, and both of them threw out the wills.
So, Tony Spann. We didn't really waltz up into the North County, but there were characters there that you probably knew better than others. I interviewed Tony a few years ago, and there were others like that: Tony Rizzo, Jack Beckman,
I knew them
Jim
all.
Summer, Charlie Colasano.
Tony, let me tell you, Tony, he would get up at every bar meeting and recite his poetry as late as 2 years ago, and he's got to be close to 100.
Yeah.
But the thing about Tony Spann was there were 3 of them. It was Tony Spann, Dick Whipple, and Bert Snyder.
Yeah, that's right.
Bert Snyder. And they all did matrimonials. They were known for their matches. So it'd be Tony, Bert, and Whipple. And every time they'd go into court, one of the judges would say, "Here goes another dog and pony show." They would put on their acts for their clients, and it was quite entertaining.
Yeah.
But then they'd go in and settle. Yeah, Bert Snyder. Bob Daly once told me I was trail-wise, because street-wise, after we had the garbage dump, the Obrachtas, the garbage dump case. And Bob was on one side, and I think Darrell Brodigan might have been with him at that time. And, we got into it. He accused me of using the wrong IRS figures, and I accused him of that. But then we'd all go out for a drink.
Yeah.
And in those days, I used to joke, don't put this on, but I'd say, remember when we used to be able to drink and drive? I can't say that. I'm a judge,
I get it.
But,
It's a different world. Yeah.
it's a different world. So anyway, and you were talking about Dan Paloe.
Yeah.
He's gone. He was, how I knew Dan, I never had many cases with Dan, but when he worked in the county attorney's office, his office was right upstairs from me. And he'd wander down every afternoon about 3 o'clock to see if the coffee was hot,
But Dane's still around, though. I mean, he's not practicing, but
I think he's in Arizona.
Oh, is he?
He's not well.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Yeah, I'm dating myself, but probably 4 or 5 years ago, I saw him at Tim Hortons at some place. We just
Yeah, his son is oncologist, I believe, or, Dan was sick a few years ago, and then he had a relapse, and Peter keeps in touch with him, Peter Clark.
Peter Clark. Give me your best Peter Clark story.
Well,
Or stories.
or stories. I practiced with Peter for 9 years, and his bars, when he would get up at those bar association meetings and just tell jokes, I mean, he's just very good at ad-libbing, And I remember once he sent me, he said, "Lydia, how would you like to go to Little Valley?" I'm like, "Why do I want to go to Little Valley?" "Well, it's a very simple eviction. You just have to go and you'll talk to," I think it was Feeman. He's retired now too. "And it won't take very long." But he didn't tell me that the tenant was Amish. And it did take a long time. And Peter, he loves to organize the bar association picnics and parties, and he just told me he just retired from the library board, and he was very active in the Lions Club. just an all-around good guy. I have lunch with him maybe once a month. You know, we're almost all that's left of the firm.
Yeah.
Because Don died very early on, and then Bob died in the 90s, I believe. And Richard Whipple, that was a shocker, because he wasn't really that old.
Yeah.
And and Bart is out west.
You still have a place on the lake? Did you?
I don't think he owns. I know he rents. In fact,
Periodically, you'll see him in the summer.
I saw him 2 summers ago in Westfield having lunch when we were, and Peter said he's going to be up here in August, I believe.
I need to interview Bart. He's got the greatest voice ever.
We called him the Rainmaker. You know, Bard he had the presence, you know.
Oh my God.
He had these 2 secretaries, Terry and Edna, who just ran things, you know. And I would go there once a week to work with him, every Thursday, I think. I loved working with him. I hated the drive. Who would have thought I would have spent 24 years driving back and forth to Mayville? And I'd wind up in a ditch every 7 years. So that's when the last 7 was when I realized I had to retire. But Dick Whipple, I remember, you know, you hear a lot of stories about Richard. He was a bit of a scatterbrain, even though he was a math genius. I think he went to MIT or something. One of the first memories I have of Dick Whipple was he was representing this woman in a matrimonial. And her husband was the bad boy of Fredonia. I won't say his name, but he may have died, but his son is still around. And I was coming down the steps, because my office was upstairs, when I see this guy come running down the hall into the conference room where Richard was meeting with his client, the wife. And I swear to God, Richard stood in front and in between them. He put himself right in between them and he said, "Back off." And the guy did. And I was like, whoa. I thought he was a goner, you know. But, yeah.
Did you ever have any incidents in surrogates court? Normally you don't think of that. Think more like family court where emotions are wrought and things happen. Do you recall anything where security needed to be?
Yeah, we did. It was our old friend up in Dunkirk, Henry, I'll think of his name. We did have to call security, and it was really weird because his girlfriend's son had been killed on the railroad tracks in Dunkirk. And they had hired this Buffalo lawyer to do a personal injury. And of course the defense was he was drunk walking on the tracks or whatever. And they found out that they had to get an administrator appointed. I don't know if I should say that name. So Hank comes in with his petition, and I took it in, I looked at it, and I said, "Are you his father?" And he said, "No." And I said, "How are you related?" And he said, "I'm not." I said, "Well," I said, "you can't be the administrator." "What do you mean I can't be?" And it went on and on like that for a while. And I tried to explain to him, you know, that the mother could be the administrator, the public administrator, but he didn't want any of it. And eventually, Mary Lou or somebody ran out and said, "We need to have him removed."
Yeah.
He was the one that got removed from the school board meetings in Dunkirk, just so you, and
It was consistent.
yeah, and the radio station case. That was one of my first cases, the radio station case, yeah.
And Judge Adams' daughter was intimately involved in that, Carol.
Carol Adams, I did see her at Lee Towns' funeral. She started that missionary, the charities work up in Dunkirk.
Right, Presbyterian. Yeah.
And then she married a minister, and I think they're in Texas or something.
Oh, that's correct. All correct.
Yeah. Lee Towns had Muriel was his secretary, was it?
Yeah. No, Muriel was his wife.
What was his wife? I'm trying to think who was secretary.
Oh gosh, Becker.
Millie Becker.
Yep, no.
She and Ruth Cord were very close friends, so Millie would, every 3 o'clock, I could count on Millie to be in our back office having coffee. So, and that's where I would pick up my ears. And then later on, I had Sheila Rocky and Sandy Beckering worked for me. And I used to send Sheila down to the break room to find out what was going on.
There you go.
You know. And Sandy, she's retired. Sheila's still working.
Is she?
And I hired Judge Cass's secretary for years, Cynthia Bassinet. She was my secretary. She started at Peter's secretary, then she was my secretary. And then about 6 months after I took the job in Mayville, we had an opening, and I hired her there, and then Judge Willard hired her. And that's how.
I did not know that story.
Yeah, I also gave Kathy Krause her first job.
No kidding.
She was my deputy chief clerk for several years before she went to Supreme, and now she's the chief clerk of the Erie County Surrogate Court. You knew that, no?
I did not. I was just going to ask. I didn't. What happened to Kathy?
I believe she's the chief clerk. The last I saw, because she was hired by Barbara Howe. Judge Howe, who's retired now, and I were classmates at law school. And now Asia Mosey, Judge Mosey, is now the surrogate there. And the last I heard, Kathy Krause, they had called me, said, "What do you think?" I said, "Sure, why not?"
And you knew that you were coming down here today. You agreed, willingly or not, to come and be interviewed. And as you're anticipating coming in, you made notes and all of that stuff. Are there questions I should have asked you?
I think it's really important to get down some of these lawyers that you won't remember, like
Correct.
John Foster. And he used to go around at the parties picking up all the bones of the steak, and Blueberry Hill.
Yeah.
And Lucian and them cooking the steaks there. I mean, I just keep thinking about these things. Of course, Sue Amsler was a dear friend and a colleague of mine. And, I mentioned her. Sam Drayle, didn't mention Sam.
Oh, good.
He was
Yeah.
I saw Sam not too long ago, very casually dressed, sitting at DeJohn's Pizza Place. But in the day, Sam and his brother David,
Yeah.
twins, were practicing, and Sam and I did not get along in the real estate field. He was always critical, and Don Brandt would say, "Don't let it bother you." He does the same thing to me. When I went to Mayville, I was delighted to see Sam's papers, because he couldn't do forget the citations. Everybody in Sam's world got along. He had these estates where they would and Diane was his secretary. Every once in a while he'd have to do a citation, and he'd call me and we'd figure it out. John Fitzgerald, did you remember him?
I do. And our paths crossed at a bar picnic because I would be invited up to the Northern Conference.
It was sad that John's son, Junior, who's an a surgeon, osteopath, he operated on my ankle. He just retired. I remember I'm lying in the hospital room having broken my ankle, and I'm all groggy, and in comes the son, and he says, "I'm John Fitzgerald." And I said, "Oh, I knew your father." That was all I could think of.
Yeah.
Bruce Manley.
Bruce Manley, yeah.
Didn't know him well, but Bill Schober practiced with him. And they
Did
said,
you know Bill's mother?
No, Mary. Not Mary, that was his aunt.
Was it aunt? Okay.
It was his aunt. she would call Peter up at midnight to practice law. Peter told me, Mary Schober was one of the first women lawyers in the county.
Yeah.
And Peter said she was different. She kept her own hours, but she was their aunt. I believe Bill and John's parents were killed in an auto accident. And at that time, John Schober was practicing in Buffalo. Of course, he's back now, and I see him in town court all the time.
She, the Mrs. Schober, she was with Bruce Manley. Manley and Schober, wasn't it?
No, that was Bill.
Bill?
Yeah, Manley and Schober was Bill.
Okay.
She was on her own.
Okay.
And like I said, Peter said she would call him at home at midnight and want to talk about a real estate deal. But, and you know, in those days, to be a woman attorney, it took a little bit.
Yeah, it did, yeah.
You know, I always say that most of, like, the women attorneys that came before me are tough. You know, there's a couple like Judge Renee Roth, she's the retired surrogate from New York County that I'm still in touch with, and, you know, quite a few of the others. When I went to law school, I'm sure Cynthia was the same way. There was like less than 20%. When you're right, it was less than 20%. I remember Supreme Court when Judge Gerasi got on the bench, and you know how the counsel tables were always open? He wanted a privacy skirt.
Really?
That was, you know.
Well.
Larry Zobel I need to talk about.
Yeah, please.
See, that's why I wrote down some names.
This is great, yeah, I'm glad you're doing this.
Because Larry and I were the two Jewish members of the, you know, the Italian Jewish that Phil Cal always had. And I remember one holiday, my Pam Harrell, who took over from Mary Lou Paulus's deputy, and Pam decided she was going to do like a Hanukkah thing, and she made honey cake and stuff. And we had Larry come down. Larry, when he's the reason I became the president of the Bar Association in Northern Chautauqua so quickly, because he was the president and Scott Harley was the secretary-treasurer. And you move from secretary-treasurer. And he was appointed hearing examiner. And in those days, OCA wouldn't let you do both. Now, they don't care. I don't think they do. So Scott Harley moved up, and then I moved up. But, you know, Larry was another one of those. He and Kevin. You know who Larry was really good friends with? Bill Maldivin. You should maybe get Bill Maldivin sometime. I think he and Larry had a band when they, and you know, in the 70s or 60s. And Kevin Laumer will know about that too, because they were, I think the three of them were very tight. Let me mention some more names. We talked about Autumn. You know, we had no security. I'll tell you a funny story.
Yeah.
I'm sitting in my office, and Judge Stephen, it was Judge Stephen, I don't know, his door was closed. And all of a sudden, I heard the weirdest noises coming from, and I'm like, what the hell should I do? Those are really strange noises. And so I'm like tapping it. Come in. I said, Judge, are you okay? He says, we're practicing turkey calls. I swear. And it was Gary Jambrone. Remember Gary? That's what made me think of the security. There was another time when I was down in New York for a meeting in the city, because I was on these committees, and we were in Jamestown, and Judge Stephen Cass is sitting in his office with Frank, one of the security guards, and they were talking hunting and getting ready for there, you know, the season. I always found out the first month I worked there, you don't schedule on the first, on November it's Pennsylvania Monday, now it's not Monday anymore, and on the next one Monday. And so they were planning, and there was no one was on the door, and in walks Harry Brandt and Judge Kane.
Oh, no.
And I'm like, Judge Cass, did you tell them that I keep telling you you can't do that? You know, but we didn't, you know, in the old days, Judge Willard, I used to say, Judge, don't you want security? I didn't care because, you know, whatever he wanted was good with me. And he would say, well, when your number's up, it's up. And I'd say, well, what if my number isn't up? And what if Jones Jusko's number isn't up? You know, because we started in Hotel Jamestown.
I do remember that very well.
And then we were up in the 5th floor of the South County office building for a long time. And then they moved us up to City Court and chambers there. And then I guess they don't do it anymore.
Yeah.
They stopped after I left. Just want to make sure there's... I got one good story, another good story. You have time or?
Oh, I'm here for you. This is great.
So, Judge Willard, you know, when he was when he did the matrimonials, I don't know, you never did matrimonials, but if people couldn't agree, they would have he would have an auction. I remember he once auctioned off a glass bottle collection. So here we are years later, and Roger Pyle, remember Roger? He was, for a while, he was the commissioner of social services.
Yeah.
His wife was a Moscato, I believe. And Jim Moscato, who still practices in Gowanda. So I believe, I might be getting the facts wrong, but his wife passed away. And there was this, we were told there was a house full of antiques that had to be divided. And they were fighting over the antiques. Jim wanted some, Roger wanted some, and then there was a great Uncle Eddie somewhere in Canada who wanted some. And maybe the third time we'd had these people in, Judge Stevens says, I've had it. Everybody, get your coats on, we're going to Gowanda. So there's Judge Cass with me following him, with Lori Holder, security,
Yeah.
and Melinda Johnson, his court reporter, and all of the people, Moscato, and we drive to Gowanda. And we get to this house, and we open the front door. I mean, top to bottom, 3 floors of antiques. And I mean, stuff like Pierpont lamps and commemorative plates. We spent the day, Judge Cass would go, okay, we'll go by birthday. Whose birthday is first? You pick, you pick. We did that all day. And got it settled. And then a few months later, we had an auction for an airplane engine. We auctioned off a canoe once. And I think it might have been Judge Willard. We had a Swedish Bible that we auctioned off. But it was funny that Gowanda trip, I just thought, I can't believe this. We're all going to Gowanda. And we're going to, you know, I'd never seen so many antiques. It was beautiful. Augie Jankowski, remember Augie?
I do.
He was blind since he was 20, and he had his dog, you know, his dog. And I don't know why, I remember Peter making dog jokes with Augie. I mean, you know, we all had a good sense of humor in those days, but, and let me tell you one more thing. Let me tell you about 9/11. Judge Willard was a hearing examiner. because that was 2001. Judge Stephen had just gotten on the bench. And he would use Stephen's office, he'd come in, check in and stuff. And he would always get there early.
Oh, yeah.
And I would get there like 5 to 9, 9. And I heard what was going on the radio. And I came running into the building, and I'm like, Judge Willard, do you know what's going on? And he's like, I don't know. We had like these computers they were just the slowest things in the world. And so we went into the courtroom, and we dragged in the TV from the courtroom, but we were stunned.
Absolutely.
I mean, we just sat there, stunned. And I just, I don't even remember Steve showing up, because it was just so, weird that we were all just sitting there. And so that was 9/11.
Yeah, and everybody has their story. Where were you at 9/11? Yeah.
Remember Sheriff Bentley when he parted the waters of the Amish community?
No.
Remember?
No.
There was I'm not sure if they were Amish and Mennonite, but the Lapps. And they owned a farm, and there was something to do with family court. We weren't involved in any of it, but there was a big brouhaha in front of the courthouse. Everybody, and they were fighting, and the sheriffs were there, and the Lapps were there, and everybody's fighting. And along comes Sheriff Bentley. He just parted. He just parted the crowd. Me and I think Tom White and a couple others, we were watching from the then law library. That was the big law library. We were watching from the windows, but I have a lot, those memories are, it's been 40 years.
What's the question I haven't asked you?
I don't know. What am I doing now? You don't want to know. I'm climbing mountains and living with indigenous tribes in the Amazon. Everything I wanted to do, but I couldn't do when I was a lawyer.
Oh, really?
I always wanted to be an archaeologist.
Yeah.
So I saw this advertisement for, it said, we're looking for archaeologists, geologists, historians to go on this exploration north of Bogota in these mountains to look for Muisca, M-U-I-S-K-A, artifacts and stuff, and they make a movie. So I sent an email. I said, I'm not an architect. I have no skills that you would need, but I would love to go. Will you take me? So they took me.
What a thrill.
And then I went with the same group to the Amazon. But there is something to say, Greg, for retirement.
Well, not too far from there, so I'll be joining you. Let's see.
Sue, I wanted to just say, when I started practice, I think it was me, Cindy, and Judge Clerk were the only 3 women in this county.
Right.
And within a few years, Betsy Stager came on board, Tom's wife now, but she was Betsy in those days, and Sue Evans, and Nancy Young. Now, Nancy was with you for a while.
Right. Yeah.
And, it still seemed like we were outnumbered. And I never used my being, a woman for anything. But you did have to be tough. There were times. But when I look around now, it's amazing to me, all these young women attorneys, and the world has changed.
In our local bar, a number of them work for the county, and when you come to Bar Association meetings now, it's predominantly women
Is it really?
that attend those meetings, and it's probably 50-50, just if you had to do a census.
Oh, wait, one more thing.
Sure.
Then I've run out. Believe it or not, I've run out. We used to hold court we started surrogates court. We would share City Hall with Augie. And then Walter Dragg came along and kicked us out. Walter is actually doing very well. I get along great with Walter. Tom McKelvey said when Walter was running for surrogate against Judge Stephen that he was going to try and sell tickets to what would happen if me and Walter became. But Walter was another one of those practitioners. He was very meticulous, and I guess he moved to Orchard Park now. His kids are there. But so anyway, we got kicked out of City Hall, and we went to the next building over, and that didn't work out. And then they put us in the Masonic Hall across, the old Masonic, it was, on the second floor, and it had this elevator that just, from the basement, it smelled of that mechanical. I really didn't like taking it up. And we were there for quite some time. We had our computers, we had all our equipment. We were there one Wednesday morning, and I remember we had a Buffalo lawyer who left his agenda or his appointment book, and we were getting ready to leave. And Melinda Johnson said, oh, look, he left that. I'll take it. I'm going back to Mayville, and he'll be looking for it. And he said, okay. And then I said, Judge Cass, we shut down the photocopier. And he said, oh, yeah. Okay, let's go. We're gone. 7 o'clock that night. I hadn't been watching TV. 7 o'clock that night, Judge Cass calls me, Stephen Cass. He says, you burnt down the building. I'm like, what? He said, you didn't shut the copier off, did you? I said, what are you talking about? He said, Lydia, turn on the TV. The building burned down. It was actually an electrical thing.
We busted your chops.
And he did the same to Melinda, so we were all in it together. I guess that's, I don't know.
So what advice, if anything, you would give to somebody who practiced law? You're in the private side, the public side, and if I were a 26-year-old recent graduate thinking about coming to Chautauqua County, well, would you have any kind of a
do
advice?
Trust in estate work. That's where, you know what it is, Greg. There are a lot of lawyers your age, my age, Peter's age. There are a lot of wills floating around, and you almost, I mean, it's a good field if you're interested in numbers, which I wasn't, but you know, concepts, and it's complicated. We have our own set of, we don't follow the CPLR, we follow the SCPA, you know. It's a very different fields of practice. But I really think that even though everybody thinks they can draw a will, I haven't seen too many young lawyers. Now, Lana might know. You know, she's the chief clerk now. But I haven't seen too many of the young lawyers. It's not the most exciting field in the world, but I don't think you lose money.
Yeah.
If you want to make a decent living, where you don't necessarily have clients calling you Saturdays and Sundays over their real estate or matrimonials, and you want, you know, a nice life where you can either walk or drive to work in 5-10 minutes, and you know, that's the life I would still choose to live. I have friends who went to work in the big city, in Manhattan, and did very well, and never interested me. And I don't think they ever got the experience. I mean, there was a time when I was doing separation agreements, real estate, and estate and trust work, research. Not that I did them all well, but I think when I came to be chief clerk, I was the first chief clerk, now it's Lana, who had actually done the work. I knew what it took to do an accounting. And I can remember many Sunday mornings when I was spread out on my bed with, you know, the schedules and, you know, just to kind of get it done. And I think it made a difference. It was hard at first. A lot of the older attorneys didn't want to practice, didn't want to follow the SCPA. I mean, it was tough. Yeah. You know, Autumn had her way of doing things, and, you know, Willard had said, you know, we've got to kind of do what OCA, you know, we've got to, and at that time there was a big push for uniform forms and uniform this, and I was on the Chief Clerks Association Forms Committee, and I kept saying, can't we just have plain English? That's the other thing I would advise young lawyers today. Forget the heretofores and hereafters. Right. Write English. And I mean, Arthur Bailey, of course, if you want to read some of his flowing literature, it was beautiful. You know, he's a character. He's still around. Still is. I've interviewed Arthur a few times. You know, Arthur well, you know about his polio. Yeah. I remember, at first I couldn't understand why Judge Willard was so close. They were all close. Arthur, I think Bud Wright also had, Bob Wright had polio. But Judge Willard told me that they would drive to Buffalo to visit them in the hospital. And, you know, it was a small clique of lawyers in those days. But I remember, you know, Arthur got involved. This is the last one. Arthur got involved with this class action, and it was a big class action. I don't remember, it was a medical malpractice. And one of the local lawyers was in Washington, D.C. for visiting something. You know, he had the kids, the family, and there was this big conference going on, and there was all of these hotshot PI lawyers from all over the place, and, you know, he says, and I look up the stairs, and there's Arthur Bailey coming, walking down with an entourage. And it was funny. You know who we haven't mentioned are two family court judges now, Michael Sullivan and Jeff. And Michael started practice shortly after I did, and there was a time when Michael and Betsy and I were thinking about, you know, going into practice. But Michael, he worked very hard. He really liked his family court appointments. And Jeff, he didn't appear in surrogates court much, because Chuck did. But whenever he did, he had the driest sense of humor. No question. I would love when we were in trial and Jeff would just come out with something, I'd be sitting there like that. I'm sure he doesn't do that anymore, but. Not on the court, but, oh yeah. Well, this has been fabulous, Lydia Romer. Well, I hope so. You know what? I've been thinking over for a number of years, and I even told this to Judge Steve, we need to write some of this down. I mean, I wrote a bunch down, but there's so much more. We did so many. We had some funny times, you know, because Judge Stephen and I are a bit of characters. You know, we have these personalities, and I went everywhere with them. And we just had some good times, you know. We went to we did a presentation at the Culinary Institute for the Public Administrators, and I remember we were driving to Binghamton to do a seminar, and I was going to meet him at the Jamestown exit, leave my car, and he was going to drive. And I said, okay. I said, if you have nothing else you want to talk about, I'll start with my life history from the age 9 months onward. And we could do that for 5 hours. But we didn't. You know, I'd be remiss if I didn't say thank you for what you did to the Robert Jackson Center early on, finding the surrogate files of Justice Jackson and making the originals available. Yeah, we still have that agreement.
It's a loan agreement.
It was a loan
It's a
agreement.
loan.
Yes. I'm sure I told Len about it, Houston about it, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But yes, that was fascinating.
Yeah.
I think we found one transcript where he was a guardian ad litem, didn't we?
Yeah. Oh, sure.
Yeah, just to see somebody that famous and good, and just to see his early,
Yeah.
it was his early wills. We had a couple of witnesses.
No,
Yeah.
you were fantastic. So you were one.
And enjoyed that.
Yeah, well, that was an early highlight for the Jackson Center. Well, thank you, Lydia. This is fantastic.
I hope so, because I do. I really I want people to know how we were in the old days.
Yeah.
Not me in particular, but like all these lawyers that are gone.
Well, you caused, and I must tell you for the camera, not only your reputation was as a tremendous high-quality person, but a person that everybody feared. And I say that in the most loving sense, but we knew when you were direct, and if we were out of line, you would let us know that, and you would pull us in, and we'd get it done correctly. But
I was always willing to help a lawyer who wanted to learn. And I took a couple of young lawyers in, like Michael Siri and Greg Dre. I just took the lawyers who were, honest and decent. That I wanted them to get it right. And I guess it's because I have very strong feelings about surrogates court and the way the law was written and what it means. And I'm on this committee that keeps reviewing stuff for the legislature. And I just think it's important that you get it right, because you're dealing with people's money, their lives, their spouses who, people pass away and they've got all sorts of issues, and you want to make sure that it's all there. Don Brandt used to tell me, I sat there, I was 7 o'clock one night trying to balance a real estate closing or something, maybe it was an accounting, and I'd say, Don, we're only off by a couple of pennies, and he'd say, if you're off by a penny, you're off by a lot. You never know,
So,
because Bob Daly used to have the miscellaneous penny. He always had that miscellaneous change.
It always balanced.
Yeah.
Always balanced. Well, thank you. This has been phenomenal. You've been an asset to the Bar Association.
Thank you, Greg. So have you. I think we've known each other almost as long as I've been here. Probably didn't meet until 90, because I really didn't hang out in Jamestown much. But you have been a shining, a shining star to show what a good lawyer can do when they set their mind to it, with all the nasty things people say about lawyers. You're with a tremendous firm, and what you and the rest of those guys did with the Robert H. Jackson, it's internationally known. Greg, you made us, people who never heard of Chautauqua County know who we are now. I had a friend from Brooklyn. She's the chief clerk of the surrogates court in Brooklyn. Her daughter's going to SUNY Fredonia next year. She's driving up on the thruway, and the first thing she saw was the Phillips Lytle building. She has a case in Brooklyn with Phillips Lytle. And the second thing she said was, I never thought Chautauqua existed. But yeah, Greg, we've had, there have been a lot of good lawyers, and that's what, I used to tell the people, our lawyers can compete with Buffalo lawyers any day of the week, and even more so, right?